Let's head to Parliament because Minority Leader Haruna Idrisu has described as a travesty of justice the ruling from the Cape Coast High Court annulling the outcome of the 2020 parliamentary elections in Assin North. He claims it is an attempt to use the courts to determine the balance of power in Parliament, but the minority remains unshaken. He says the judge erred in law and in facts. Mr. Idrisu warns cooperation will suffer because of what has happened.
On some developments from the Cape Coast High Court, which seeks to suggest a possible by-election in the Assin North constituency and the potential of our colleague, the Honorable Kwesen Gachi, being denied his legitimate role as an elected representative of the Assin North constituency, which election he won outright as a citizen born and bred in that community, but for some time had to sojourn in Canada. He subsequently, as I understand, renounced his citizenship, expressed so far back 2019, got his certificate at least before the elections. Before the elections. His renunciation certificate was before the elections. We in the minority remain unshaken. We are confident that it is our seat, it will remain our seat. Our first is to use the same legal processes and legal forum and opportunities available within the Constitution. We will contest the ruling. The judge erred both in law and in fact. It's a travesty of justice. But what is worrying, we don't want to believe.
But Majority Chief Whip in Parliament, Frank Anodom, says the ruling vindicates the position the NPP side has held since 7th January that John Gyakye Kwesen was not validly elected. He says the minority leaders claim that there is an attempt to alter the balance of power in Parliament is unfortunate.
But for what the minority leader said, we need to correct these things. And as we are engaging in social engineering as a country, some of these things should be dealt with ab initio. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important for us to recognize that if you recall, even before we were sworn in to be part of the 8th Parliament, ab initio in the chamber, we as members of the majority raised issue of eligibility related to the Assin North Member of Parliament elect then. If you recall, there were dramatic representation even from our side. And we had cautioned the implication of that decision for the member to sit in and be part of that decision making on that day. Each one of you will bear witness. And so today, we have been vindicated because from day one, we had made our point abundantly clear that the member was invalidly elected. And lo and behold, a court of proper jurisdiction has come to make a ruling. Now, I respect the minority leader, but for him to say that rubbing in government influence and the likes is totally flawed and should be rejected ab initio. We think that if you look at the provisions in our law, the pieces of legislation as well applied, Article 94(2), Section 92 of the Representation Act, and then the Canadian Citizen Act, all put together, were the anchor of the ruling from the court. Now, be it as it may, any law-abiding citizen, when there is a court ruling and you don't agree in law, you need to file a review or go for an appeal. Don't bring in the executive. We have built our country to the extent that we need to respect separation of powers, because the honorable minority leader is part of the legislative arm of government, and the court is part of the judiciary. So if there is a court ruling and you don't agree, you go and appeal. You don't organize a press conference on the spur of the movement and start throwing jabs at the executives. I think they are getting confused, and I can understand them. It has blown them off their feet. But for us, it has only justified our claim at the initial stages. So we will advise the minority, if they have any basis to expect a ruling otherwise, all they need to do is to subject themselves to the process. And let's see what will happen from the law court. So it's much ado about nothing. We can understand that this has unsettled them, but if they had reflected upon it deeply, especially the day of swearing in, they will have realized that they were going on a wild goose chase. Let it be a lesson to them. And let's respect the sanctity of our law court. When there is a decision from our courts, we should subject ourselves to the due process, and where we think that we can make an appeal, we make necessary appeal accordingly. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
That was Majority Chief Whip Frank Anodompre there, explaining how the Cape Coast High Court has vindicated the NPP in that case, which was filed by one Michael some time ago after the December elections. And he was actually talking about how Jachi Kwesing held dual citizenship. So the High Court today has cancelled the 2020 parliamentary elections in that constituency, the Assin North constituency, and it's asking that the MP does not hold himself as MP from now on, and also asking for fresh elections to be held in that constituency. Thankfully, my colleague Opoku Gakpo, who is in Parliament for us, joins us with more. Joseph Opoku Gakpo, we've heard from the minority leader, Haruna Idrisu, but how are his colleagues in Parliament reacting to this judgment?
For some individuals on the minority side, like Roxin Dafiamakpo, he made the point that he's disappointed in the ruling. He thinks that this is something that should actually not have happened. He goes on to make the point that as far as the processes are concerned, what the will of the people is, which is that John Jachi Kwesing represents them, is what will eventually prevail regardless of what happens. He made the point that the NDC is going to contest this very vigorously, using the various courts of the country, from the appeals courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And Mr. Dafiamakwo makes the point that even when it gets to become necessary that the whole poll be rerun, he is confident that the NDC would go ahead and retain that particular seat. On the MPP side as well, beyond Frank Anodompre, other NPP MPs are reacting. Vincent Assefa, who is the MP for Old Tafo, for example, draws attention to how come this MP, Mr. Jachi Kwesing, was actually not supposed to have participated in the election of a Speaker of Parliament, speaking of Alban Bagbin and the Michael Kwe context. And he makes the point that this situation is something that he's brought on himself. He says that he is asking for a situation where the necessary criminal processes against him should be triggered, not only for contesting that particular seat in the constituency, but also for participating in a vote on the floor of the House when, according to Mr. Atefua, he knew that he shouldn't have participated in that particular process. So the MP for Otafu also makes the point that those necessary processes, as far as any possible criminal action, should be instituted in that regard, and that it was very much out of place that he participated in the election that actually led to the election of Alban Bagbin as Speaker. So those have been some of the additional responses beyond what we heard from the Majority Chief Whip and also the Minority Leader. Aisha.
How is the Speaker himself reacting to this judgment, Gakpo? Do we know? If you can, I'm asking how the Speaker himself is reacting to this judgment.
It's not something that has come up yet on the floor of the House. It's not been raised at all. It's just been a conversation that's happening on the corridors of the House, because then the indication we get is that officially no such notification has actually gotten to Parliament as far as this particular ruling is concerned. And so we're expecting that probably in the next few days, when that official communication happens, then we would hear probably from the Speaker and other leaders on the floor of the House itself.
What does this mean for business of the House, especially as far as the minority say on the floor of the House?
Warning that's gone out from the minority leader, Haruna Idrisu, that going forward, cooperation will be affected by what has happened as far as the ruling of the Cape Coast Court is concerned. He refused to respond to further questions on what he meant by that, but speaking to some of the other minority MPs, they make the point that there shouldn't be a deliberate effort to actually get them out of Parliament, and government, in doing that, allegedly should be expecting that they would cooperate in terms of getting government business done on the floor of the House. So that's the kind of warning that's actually going out from the minority side, that when it comes to compromises and putting their heads together to get work done, this ruling would affect it to a certain extent. But Frank Anodon has been responding to that as well, and he makes the point that no individual should see him or herself or themselves as bigger than Parliament as an institution, and that they on the MPP side will do what they need to do to continually get government business going, instead of any caution that it may be affected because of what has happened in the court today.
Joseph Opoku-Gakpo is our man in Parliament.